Imagine a summer afternoon in 1829 in the bustling Japanese city of Osaka. But instead of the usual bustling business scenes, the townspeople witness a horrific scene straight out of history's darkest pages. Six condemned people, three men and three women, are paraded through the streets. Some of them were already dead, their bodies preserved in salt for the execution. As the crowd watches, the authorities tie each victim to a cross and begin methodically impaling them with spears. A woman named Toyota Mitsuji, the only survivor of the female prisoners, is said to have laughed out loud as the first spear pierced her flesh, maintaining a chilling calm. The scene, a mass crucifixion in the heart of a great city, sent shock waves through Japan. But it was just one of countless strange mysteries, tangled threads woven into the tapestry of human history. They were forgotten stories, hidden conspiracies, and truths twisted over the centuries. To unravel the mystery of the woman who laughed at death in Osaka, we must first travel back nearly 400 years, across an ocean, to a distant shore in the New World, where another mystery whispered in the wind. In 1534, French explorer Jacques Cartier first landed in Newfoundland, a land he believed he was discovering for Europe. He expected to encounter indigenous tribes that had never had contact with the outside world. Instead, he got an unexpected shock. A group of natives greeted him with a few words of Basque, an ancient and unique language from a small region between France and Spain. Not only that, they told him about the red-haired men from the ocean who had arrived there generations before. How could this have happened? How could a tribe in North America have learned the language of sailors from across the Atlantic, decades before major European nations began formal exploration? The answer lies in a fascinating hypothesis. The intrepid Basque seafarers may have quietly reached the Americas before Christopher Columbus. This is not a far-fetched theory. The Basques have been known since the Middle Ages as masters of the sea. They were pioneers in commercial whaling and experts in preserving cod with salt, creating a thriving trade by 1000 AD. They had the means, skills, and experience to undertake long ocean voyages. But what was their motive? The answer comes down to one word: cod. In the 15th century, fish was a staple of the European diet, especially with Catholic Church rules requiring fish to be eaten on several days of the year. Traditional fishing grounds were either depleted or under fierce competition. In the 1470s, for example, the Hanseatic League monopolized the cod trade in Iceland, pushing Basque sailors out of their familiar turf. Faced with dwindling catches, it is believed that Basque crews increasingly headed west in search of new, richer fishing grounds. And they found it. The waters off Newfoundland and Labrador were said to be the world's largest cod gold mine. But the most important thing about this theory is that they kept their discovery secret. Unlike royally funded explorers seeking fame and territory, these fishermen had no reason to plant flags or write memoirs. Their fortune lay in the fact that no one else knew where they had sourced their fabulous hauls of cod and whale oil. They were masters of secrecy, and their unique Euskera language created an additional cultural barrier that helped them keep their trade secret. They silently crossed the ocean, exploited the resources of the New World, and quietly returned home, leaving rivals like Portugal, England, and France in the dark. There are even physical clues. British customs records show that Basque traders shipped unusually large shipments of beaver fur to England between 1380 and 1433. Curiously, by the 14th century, beavers had all but disappeared from the areas of Europe the Basque had access to. Yet they were importing bundles of fur, rolled in a style typical of indigenous peoples in eastern Canada. If these furs did indeed come from the New World, it would mean that the Basques were in North America a century before Columbus. The Basque secret is a secret kept for profit, a strategic silence on the vast seas. But history holds much darker secrets. Secrets not whispered on the decks of ships, but hidden behind the closed doors of royal castles. These secrets are not revealed in words, but in a cruel act of betrayal, written into history in blood. The secret of the Basque seafarers is a secret woven of salt and wind, kept for profit, whispered over the white-capped waves of the North Atlantic. But history has other secrets, Secrets born of ambition and power, hidden not in the vastness of the ocean, but within the cold stone walls of royal castles. These secrets are not revealed in a whisper, but in a dramatic act of betrayal, a cruel act that will be remembered forever in blood. Welcome to Scotland, 1440, and welcome to the Black Supper. Picture Edinburgh Castle on a cold November evening. Inside the Great Hall, flickering torchlight casts dancing shadows across the ancient stone walls. A lavish banquet is taking place. Music, laughter, and the clinking of glasses echo throughout the room. In the most prestigious seat on the throne sits a boy of 10. He is King James II of Scotland. Though he bears the crown, he is just a child, a pawn in the ruthless game of power played by the regents. Beside the king sat two guests of honor, also teenagers, 16-year-old William Douglas, the 6th Earl of Douglas, and his younger brother, David. The Black Douglas family was the most powerful, wealthy, and influential noble family in Scotland at the time. Their power was so great that they were seen as a potential threat to the throne itself. After the death of their father, young William had suddenly become the most powerful nobleman in the kingdom, at least on paper. Their presence at the king's table tonight was seen as a sign of reconciliation, an attempt to heal the political rifts that were tearing the kingdom apart. Scotland was a seething cauldron of intrigue at the time. The previous king, James I, had been assassinated 3 years earlier, propelling his 6-year-old son to the throne and plunging the country into a struggle for control between noble factions. Two of the most cunning figures were Sir William Crichton, the Lord Chancellor of Scotland, and Sir Alexander Livingston. They were the regents, the old wolves who were looking after the Lamb King. To Crichton and Livingston, the enormous power of the Douglas family, even in the hands of a 16-year-old, was like a sword hanging over their heads. They feared the Douglas influence. They coveted the Douglas wealth, and they decided that this threat had to be eliminated. The invitation to Edinburgh Castle was sent in the name of the king, and carried with it the promise of friendship and hospitality. In medieval culture, the rights of guests were sacred. Once a person had crossed the threshold of your home and shared a meal with you, they were protected. Killing a guest under your roof was considered a heinous crime, a flagrant violation of the rules of honor, and could bring about the curse of God. The Douglas brothers, perhaps too young and naive to see through the dark plot, accepted the invitation, believing they were coming to a peaceful feast. The feast was a joyous affair. Food was plentiful, wine flowed, and music filled the silence of the deliberations. The young king, James II, was perhaps also pleased to be dining with cousins so close in age. For a moment, it seemed that peace might indeed be achieved. But then, as the feast neared its climax, an eerie silence fell over the great hall. The music stopped. The laughter died down. All eyes turned to a servant who entered, carrying a large covered platter. The servant placed the plate on the table, directly in front of the Douglas brothers. The air in the room was thick with tension. William and David looked at each other, perhaps a moment of confusion crossing their faces. Then the lid was lifted. Beneath it was no feast. It was the head of a black bull, dark and ominous, its hollow eyes seemingly staring at the two honored guests. For a moment, no one seemed to understand what was happening. But to every Scot in the room, the meaning was clear as day. In Scottish folklore, the head of a black bull is an unmistakable omen. It is an ancient symbol of death. It is the dramatic end to a death sentence. In an instant, the tension turned to absolute terror. The doors of the great hall burst open. Armed guards, loyal to Crichton, rushed in. The reconciliation feast was over. The trap had been set, and the prey had been caught. Screams rang out, metal clashed, and the Douglas brothers were violently dragged from their seats. The cruel drama had only just begun. The symbol had been presented. The trap had been sprung. In that terrible moment, the rules of hospitality were torn apart. But the real horror lay not in the symbol, but in what followed. The desperate, unheeded pleas of a child king forced to watch his own kin being dragged to their deaths. The black bull's head lay alone on its silver platter, a bone-in greasy finale to the drama of reconciliation. The feast was dead. In that terrifying moment, The Great Hall of Edinburgh Castle had ceased to be a royal place and had become a slaughterhouse. Crichton's soldiers, who had waited patiently for the signal, moved with the ruthless efficiency of wolves. They rushed in, overturning tables and chairs, the screams of the other guests mingling with the cold metal of swords. William and David Douglas, the two young men who had been the king's guests a moment before, were seized and dragged away like beasts. But amid the chaos, a young voice struggled to cut through the madness. It was the voice of King James II. The 10-year-old king of Scotland had shot up from his chair, his face pale with horror. These were no strangers. They were his cousins, his kin. Perhaps in his young mind, he saw them as his only peers in a court of old, scheming men. They were a ray of youth in his gloomy adult world. And now they were being dragged away by his own soldiers. According to later chronicles, the young king did the only thing he could. He begged. He shouted in protest, ordering the soldiers to stop. He spoke of honor, of the sacred laws of hospitality, of the unforgivable crime of harming guests invited under one's own roof. They're my guests. They are my family. The words may have rung out, but they were only faint ripples against the stone walls of ambition. Crichton and Livingston, his regents, his teachers in the art of government, simply ignored him. The words of a child king carried no weight. His power was an illusion. In that moment, James II learned the bitterest lesson of all. His throne was a mere ornament, and he was a mere puppet in their hands. This betrayal was directed not only at the House of Douglas, but at his own kingship. The brothers were dragged from the false warmth of the Great Hall and thrown into the freezing cold of the castle courtyard. Under the dim light of a November moon, a hastily staged trial was held. It was a farcical spectacle of justice, an insult to the very concept of a trial. There was no jury, no defense attorneys, only the accusers who were also judges. William and David, still shaking with shock, were charged with treason, with plotting against the king, the very king who had just pleaded for their lives. Let's think about it backwards. A trial is supposed to uncover the truth, but the purpose of this trial is to conceal the truth. The charges are completely baseless. William Douglas was only 16. He had just inherited the title and had not committed any acts of rebellion. He had not had time to gather an army or show any political ambitions. His younger brother, David, was even younger, a child completely unconnected to the machinations of power. Accusing them of treason was like accusing a lamb of plotting against wolves. But the truth did not matter. The charges were just a pretext, a thin veneer of legitimacy applied to a political assassination. The outcome was decided before the trial began. The brothers were found guilty. The sentence was immediate, death. The cruelty did not end there. They were executed on the spot, on Castle Hill, within sight of the castle walls. Two young heads fell, ending the direct line of the powerful Black Douglas branch. Along with them, the family's closest advisor, Sir Malcolm Fleming, was captured and executed a few days later. It was a thorough purge, aimed at cutting off not just the head of the snake, but its body and venom as well. Did the young king witness all this? Or was he locked in his room, listening to the terrifying noises outside? History is not clear. But either way, the scars of that night would be seared into his soul forever. He had been forced to participate, albeit as a helpless observer, in the murder of his own family. The helplessness, humiliation, and brutality of the Black Supper would define the man James II would become, a king who would also resort to daggers and treachery to consolidate his power. 12 years later, James II would invite another Earl of Douglas to Stirling Castle under the promise of safety, and then stab him to death, a chilling echo of that fateful night. The deed was done. The Douglas heirs were dead. On the surface, it appeared to be a brutal but effective power move by Crichton and Livingston to eliminate a formidable opponent. Official history will forever blame them. But in the shadowy world of Scottish politics, things are rarely as they seem. When one looks away from the man who swung the sword, and instead at the man who profited most from the bloodshed, another, far more sinister and calculating figure begins to emerge from the shadows. a man who should have been the first to cry out for vengeance, but instead has maintained an ominous silence. The sentence had been carried out. The two Douglas boys lay dead, their blood staining the grounds of Edinburgh Castle. Officially, the story had a clear ending. Two ambitious regents, Crichton and Livingston, had set a brutal trap to eliminate the heirs of a rival family, consolidating their own power while the young king looked on helplessly. History has accepted this story for centuries. It is simple, dramatic, and has clear villains. But history is rarely simple. And if we apply the reverse thinking, asking not who did it, but a deeper question, one that ancient Roman detectives used, cui bono, who benefited, then the picture suddenly changes dramatically. A new figure emerges from the shadows, and his silence is more terrifying than the screams of his victims. The man was James Douglas, uncle of the late Earl Archibald, and great-uncle to the two murdered boys. History has given him the unfortunate but apt nickname James the Gross, perhaps not just because of his size, but because of his character. Before the Black Supper, James had been a minor scion of the Douglas family. He had lands and titles, but his power and wealth were a pale shadow of the vast fortunes his two young nephews now held. He was an older man, experienced and ambitious, watching as two young boys sat on the treasure he had longed for all his life. And then, overnight, everything changed. With William and David dead without heirs, the entire Black Douglas estate, the rich lands, the fortified castles, the private army, and the far-reaching political influence fell into James's hands. Overnight, he had gone from a middle-class nobleman to the most powerful nobleman in Scotland. He had won the feudal political jackpot. His stake in a massacre was not just huge, it was absolute. This is where his silence becomes suspicious. In an age of blood feuds, where family honor is measured by vengeance, the new head of the Douglas family should have been clear about what to do next. Assemble an army, lay siege to Edinburgh, and demand the lives of Crichton and Livingston. That was what everyone expected. But what did Fat James do? Nothing. He did not call for vengeance. He did not punish his nephew's killers. Instead, he seemed to have cooperated with them. His silence was that of a co-conspirator, not that of a grieving head of the family. Now, put yourself in the shoes of Crichton and Livingston. They were shrewd politicians. Why would they go through with such a crazy plan to kill two inexperienced boys, only to hand over all their power and wealth to Fat James, a much more cunning, dangerous, and capable man? It was strategically illogical. It was like killing two puppies only to be confronted by a full-grown wolf. Such a move was not a smart move, but an act of political suicide, unless that wasn't the real plan. Unless Crichton and Livingston weren't the only masterminds, but merely tools. The much more plausible theory is that Fat James was pulling the strings. Imagine this scenario. James approached Crichton and Livingston. He offered them a deal they couldn't refuse. You want to get rid of the Douglas, he might have said, but you're afraid of all-out war. So am I. But I have a solution. Help me get rid of my two troublesome nephews. You'll have the excuse of protecting the king from traitors. You'll get rid of the current Douglas leadership without shedding a drop of blood from your men. In return, I'll become the new Earl. I'll get what I want, and I promise not to fight you. We win. For anyone familiar with the power struggles of games like Crusader Kings, the plot is a classic one. It's a primer on how to usurp a title. Fat James uses Crichton and Livingston as his pawns, letting them do the dirty work and take the brunt of the public's ire. He, meanwhile, keeps his hands completely clean, plays the role of reluctant heir, and quietly takes the lion's share of the spoils. Even later events support this theory. When other Douglas loyalists, those who were not on James's side, became angry and besieged Edinburgh Castle, Crichton surrendered and handed the castle over to the king. Instead of being punished, he was later rewarded. This seems more like a negotiated part of the deal than a punishment. The Fat James conspiracy is a testament to how the official version of history can conceal a much darker truth, a truth pieced together centuries later by questioning the story that was told. The Black Supper remains a chilling tale of aristocratic betrayal. But not all of history's great mysteries were written in the blood of kings and earls. Some are found in the quiet, desperate notes of ordinary people, scrawled in parish registers by untrained hands. Try to name the nameless. Leave the cold castles of Scotland and travel 2 centuries forward to the foggy streets of London, where a new kind of terror reigns, and where people are dying from a cause so strange its name sounds like a forgotten line of poetry. The Rising of the Light. The intrigues of Scottish castles are aristocratic dramas, games played with human lives to win lands and crowns. Their truths are buried beneath layers of lies and propaganda written by the victors. But history is not only shaped by great events. Sometimes the deepest mysteries are found in the quiet fears of ordinary people, in their daily struggles for survival against invisible enemies. Now, let's leave the 15th century and travel to London in 1665, a city gripped by a horror greater than human treachery. It is the Great Plague. Imagine London at that time. The streets were narrow and dirty, the air thick with the smell of disease and despair. Church bells rang incessantly, not to summon worshippers, but to count the dead. Every night, the rattle of carts and the plaintive cry of "Bring forth your dead" echoed down the deserted alleys. Plague doctors in grotesque costumes, their beaked masks filled with herbs, roamed like death ravens. Death was everywhere, present and merciless. In this hellish situation, the government tried to maintain some order by publishing a weekly document called the Bills of Mortality. These were an early version of public health statistics. Each week, they listed the number of people who died in each parish and, more importantly, the cause of their deaths. But who determined the cause? Not doctors or scientists. That job fell to the searchers of the dead. They were often poor, elderly parish women with no medical training. Their job was to go to the home of the deceased, look at the body, and, based on what they saw, what the family told them, make a diagnosis. They were reluctant death detectives, using folk knowledge and simple observation to name the diseases that claimed lives. So when we read these obituaries, we enter a strange and superstitious world of medicine. Along with familiar names like plague or smallpox, we see causes like the king's disease, tuberculosis, the star of fate, stroke, or intestinal cramps. But there is one name that stands out, not because of its popularity, but because of its strangeness and eerie poetry: Rising of the Lights. In 1665 alone, hundreds of people were recorded dying from it. It wasn't a supernatural event or a trip to heaven. It was a medical diagnosis, a tangible and painful death. So what did it really mean? To solve this mystery, we have to go back to the language. Lights is a Middle English word for the lungs, probably because they're the lightest organ in the body. So, Rising of the Lights literally means the rising of the lungs. It's a strange and counterintuitive phrase. Why do the lungs rise? Put yourself in the shoes of a 17th century searcher. She enters a dimly lit room where a child has just taken his last breath. The family, in their grief, describes the final hours. The child struggles to breathe, his chest heaving violently. He makes a hoarse, barking cough. His throat seems to be constricted, and he tries desperately to inhale, making painful hissing sounds. To someone with no knowledge of anatomy, it looks as if something is rising from within the chest, rising to block the airway. The lungs, the light of the body, seem to rebel, rising into the throat to extinguish the flame of life. The rise of the light is not a scientific diagnosis, but a graphic description of a terrifying struggle for every breath. Today, medical historians believe that Rising of the Lights was most likely an umbrella term for acute respiratory distress, the main culprit of which was probably croup. Croup is an upper respiratory infection that causes swelling of the larynx and trachea and is especially common in young children. Its symptoms, a barking cough, difficulty breathing, stridor, match the descriptions of the Rising of the Lights. Other conditions, such as acute epiglottitis or severe asthma, may have also been lumped under the name. Without diagnostic tools, they could only describe what they saw. Yet the mystery remains unsolved. The term was used only by lay people, never appearing in the writings of trained physicians. And it was only recorded as a cause of death, with no record of its treatment. So the Rise of the Light, remains a medical mystery, a ghost in the annals of epidemiology. It is a mystery born of the limits of human knowledge, an attempt to name a terrible enemy within. It is a private death, a struggle for breath behind closed doors, the true cause of which has been lost to time. But on the other side of the world, in a land that has isolated itself from the outside world, another mystery is unfolding. This one is not about the betrayal of the body, but about the veneration of the soul. It is not a quiet death recorded by an old woman in London, but a brutal, public spectacle orchestrated by a powerful government. An execution so bizarre and symbolic that it will shock a nation and make us wonder, what kind of faith could lead to such a death? The rise of the light is a silent death, a mystery of the body recorded in the pages of old London notebooks. It is a private struggle, the true cause of which has faded into the mists of time. But now, let us cross both space and time to a mystery of a different kind. A mystery that does not take place in the dark, but is brutally exposed in the sunlight. A mystery not of the betrayal of the body, but of the veneration of the soul. Welcome back to Osaka, 1829, where the authorities are about to stage a public spectacle, an execution so bizarre that it defies logic and leaves a haunting question. What kind of faith could lead to such a death? The scene was horrifying. 6 crosses were erected in the middle of the square. The crowd gathered, silent, with a mixture of fear and curiosity. On 2 of the crosses, 2 flesh-and-blood men were tied, awaiting death. But what made everyone's blood freeze were the other 4 crosses. On them were also corpses, but they were long dead. Their bodies had been carefully salted to preserve them, so that they could participate in their own final punishment. Immediately, a counter-question arises. Why would a government go to the trouble of crucifying people who are already dead? An execution is meant to punish the guilty and deter others. But to punish a corpse? That suggests a deeper fear, a hatred not just of the person, but of the very idea they represent, an idea that the government believes must be utterly destroyed, both in this world and the next. Then the execution began. The executioners, their faces cold, advanced with long spears. They stabbed the living victims one by one. One man writhed in pain. But the woman named Toyota Mitsuji, the leader of the group, had a reaction that horrified everyone. As the first spear pierced her body, she laughed. A serene, almost defiant laugh in the midst of extreme pain. Was it the laugh of a martyr, someone who believed that death was only the beginning? Or was it the laugh of someone who had completely lost her mind? To understand the extreme reactions of both the victims and the authorities, we must understand the context of Edo period Japan. Under the rule of the Tokugawa shogunate, Japan was a tightly controlled society, a country that had been closed off, sakoku, from the outside world for nearly 2 centuries. The shogunate's greatest fear was foreign influence, and its number one ideological enemy was Christianity. In the 16th century, Jesuit missionaries arrived in Japan and achieved initial success, converting hundreds of thousands of people, including several powerful warlords. But the shogunate quickly recognized the threat. Christianity taught a single God, a loyalty that was greater than loyalty to the shogun and the emperor. It disrupted the strict hierarchical social order and deified the ruling elite. For the shogunate, it was an unacceptable ideological poison. A brutal crackdown ensued. Christians were hunted down, tortured, and executed en masse. Churches were destroyed, and by the 1640s, the shogunate proudly declared that Christianity had been completely eradicated from Japan. By 1827, Christianity was little more than an old story to most Japanese, a legend about rebels and foreign sorcerers who had plotted to overthrow the country. So what crime had these 6 committed? They were not leading a rebellion. They were not foreign spies. They were a small group operating in the lower echelons of Osaka society. Their leader, Toyota Mitsuji, was a widow, a fortune teller, and a faith healer. But in the eyes of the government, their crime was greater than treason. They were accused of being Christians. For shogunate officials, discovering a group of people, no matter how small and bizarre, practicing something related to Christianity was like discovering smoldering embers in a house they had thought completely extinguished. It was a threat that had to be extinguished immediately and by the most brutal means. Crucifixion, or Heretsuke in Japanese, was reserved for the most heinous crimes. The victim was tied to a cross and speared to death. Applying this punishment to a group of people whose only crime was false faith was a powerful and bloody message. And crucifying the dead took that message to a new level of terror. It was the ultimate outrage, an attempt to punish the soul, deny it any rest after death, and strike terror into the minds of anyone who might consider following that forbidden path. The shogunate's message was clear: no form of Christianity would be tolerated. But as the blood dried and the bodies were lowered, a deeper question remained. Who were these people really? Were they the last remnants of a hidden Christian faith passed down through the generations? The truth, as investigators later discovered, was stranger, more bizarre, and in many ways, far more tragic. Their faith was not inherited from secret missionaries, but cobbled together from the very propaganda created to destroy it, creating a version of Jesus that the Christian world would never recognize. The Osaka lynchings were a brutal message, a bloody affirmation by the Tokugawa shogunate that any spark of Christianity would be mercilessly extinguished. But upon closer examination, a troubling question arises. Were these executed people actually Christians? Japan has a history of Kakure Kurishiden, or hidden Christians, communities who have secretly maintained their faith through centuries of persecution, disguising their symbols and rituals under the guise of Buddhism. Could Toyota Mitsuji's group be an offshoot of this resilient community? The answer is no. The truth is far stranger. Mitsuji's group had no connection to true hidden Christians. They were not the preservers of an old faith. They were the inventors of an entirely new faith, one born out of the hatred and fear of their persecutors. It is a tale of irony at its most extreme, where propaganda creates its own monster. To understand this, we must go back a few years before the execution and meet the mysterious figure, Mitsuji's teacher, who planted the seeds of this bizarre belief. His name was Mizuno Gunki. Gunki was neither a priest nor a theologian. He was a wandering figure, a charismatic con man, a self-styled mystic who lived on the fringes of society. He had some education and even connections with the Kyoto nobility, but he was essentially an outsider. At some point, Gunki experienced a religious enlightenment. But his source of knowledge did not come from a secret Bible or a foreign missionary. His source of knowledge came from the shogunate's own anti-Christian propaganda. For 2 centuries, the shogunate had published countless stories, plays, and cheap woodblock prints, kibyoushi, that denigrated Christianity. In these works, Christians Kurishiden are not portrayed as devout believers. They are portrayed as sinister shamans who use black magic to heal, cast spells, and plot to overthrow the Japanese social order. And Jesus? He is not portrayed as a suffering Messiah. In these propaganda stories, Jesus is a powerful shaman leader, a supernatural rebel who teaches his followers black magic. The Virgin Mary is his magical companion. This is a version of Christianity twisted through the lens of fear and paranoia, a completely fictional version. Most people read these stories and feel disgust or fear. But Mizuno Gunki had a completely different reaction. He believed them. He didn't see a warning. He saw an opportunity. He read stories about Christian magic and thought, this is real power. He became obsessed with mastering this forbidden magic. He believed that by chanting the names of the magician Jesus and his companion Mary, he could tap into a limitless source of supernatural power that could heal the sick, predict the future, and even resurrect the dead and achieve immortality for himself. Gunki's goal was not salvation, but the acquisition of the powers of a sorcerer. From there, a strange cult was born. Gunki taught a small group of followers, including Toyota Mitsuji, his rituals. They created a central mantra that sounded like a bunch of foreign gibberish to the Japanese. Zenu, Maru, Hariso. But it was actually an attempt to mechanically reproduce the phrase Jesus, Maria, Pareso, Jesus, Mary, heaven, that they might have heard somewhere. Nor did they abandon their native beliefs entirely. They combined their new Christian magic with familiar folk practices. They operated under the guise of being mediums for Inari, the Shinto fox god, a popular and accepted belief. It was a perfect disguise. Mitsuji and his disciples would enter a trance, claiming to be possessed by Inari, but then use the incantation Zenu Maru Hariso to perform healing rituals. After Gunki's death, Mitsuji became the new leader. She and her followers truly believed that they were practicing an extremely powerful form of magic. They used it to make a living, providing healing and fortune-telling services to the poor and desperate people of Osaka, who were willing to pay a small fee for a little hope. And herein lies the great tragedy of the story. They were executed for a crime they had not committed in the literal sense of the word. They were not Christians. They were followers of a fictional version, a caricature of Christianity created by their own oppressors. They were essentially killed for believing the government's propaganda. 2 Kappa Upsilon Rho Iota Omicron Lambda Epsilon Kappa Tau Iota Kappa. They thought they were committing a minor crime, practicing unlicensed superstition, but they were sentenced to death for a major crime, following a forbidden faith. Their bizarre faith, a twisted echo of a religion they had never truly known, had led them to the cross. They had died for a shaman Jesus of their own making. The authorities believed that with this brutal execution, the last, strangest spark of Kirishidan influence had been extinguished forever. But in the world of folklore and popular belief, a dramatic tale like this rarely ends with the victim's last breath. A tale born of magic and ending in blood is bound to cast a shadow. And people began to whisper that the ghost of Toyota Mitsuji, the woman who had laughed at her own death, would return to haunt the very man who had brought her to justice. The brutal execution in Osaka had extinguished a strange cult, a faith born of misunderstanding and propaganda. The shogunate believed it had cut out a heretical tumor at its root, sending an unmistakable message. But in a world of folk tales, where belief in the supernatural was stronger than the shogun's laws, a dramatic tale like this could not end so simply. A story that began with magic and ended with blood was bound to leave a shadow. And soon, whispers began to spread. The spirit of Toyota Mitsuji, the woman who had laughed at her own death, would not rest. She would return for revenge, and her target would be the man who had exposed her and brought her to justice. That man was Ashio Hayakairo. Remember, he was not a greedy or cruel official. He was a Confucian scholar, a former low-ranking police officer of Osaka City, known for his integrity, intelligence, and diligence. It was he who meticulously investigated and solved the Mitsuji case in 1827. From the government's perspective, Ashio was a hero, a symbol of justice and order of the shogunate. He was the one who protected society from harmful influences. But fate had an ironic turn in store for him. A decade passed. The Kirishidan incident in Osaka was behind us. But Japanese society was facing a new crisis, worse than a small cult. The Great Famine of the Tenpo era broke out, devastating the entire country. Crop failures followed, rice prices skyrocketed, and people, especially in large cities like Osaka, began to starve to death in the streets. Ashio Hayakairo, now retired, saw it all. A follower of the Confucian ideals of benevolent government and social responsibility, he was horrified by the indifference and corruption of the officials. They and the wealthy merchants hoarded rice to drive up prices even higher, leaving the people to suffer. Ashio's upright heart could not bear the sight. He did everything he could. He petitioned the Osaka government, begging them to provide relief to the poor. His pleas were ignored. In a desperate and noble act, he sold his precious book collection and his possessions to raise money to buy food for the people. But the efforts of one man cannot overcome a corrupt system. Ashio's frustration turned to rage. In 1837, the man who had been the symbol of law and order in the shogunate did the unthinkable. He led an uprising. Together with a small group of students and peasants, Ashio Hayakairo launched an armed rebellion in Osaka. They burned down the homes of wealthy merchants and corrupt officials, with the goal of stealing rice to distribute to the poor. It was a cry for justice, an act of rebellion against brutal injustice. The uprising, though well-intentioned, was quickly and ruthlessly crushed by the shogunate's forces. Pursued and cornered, Ashio chose a tragic end. He committed suicide along with his son, rather than be captured and humiliated by the enemy. The whole of Japan was shocked. How could Ashio Hayakairo, a model official and a respected scholar, turn into a rebel? The logical explanation was anger at social injustice and government corruption. But in the minds of the people, such an explanation was too mundane. They needed something more dramatic, more supernatural to explain such an unbelievable transformation. And that's when the ghost of Toyota Mitsuji returned. The whispers began. People remembered Ashio's role in the case 10 years ago. The pieces began to connect in the public imagination. A new story, a ghostly explanation, was born. It was said that Ashio did not act of his own free will. He was cursed. The vengeful spirit, Onryo, of Toyota Mitsuji, the woman he had sent to her death, had returned. But her revenge was not simply to kill him. It was a revenge much more subtle and vicious. Mitsuji's ghost possessed Ashio, warping his loyal mind, turning him from a defender of the shogunate into its enemy. She destroyed not only his life, but his honor and legacy, turning him into a traitor in history. It was the perfect revenge. Another version of the story claims that Ashio was not possessed, but secretly converted by Mitsuji's ghost. He learned her Carishan magic and used that dark power to try to overthrow the government. This version further cements the image of Christians as subversive magicians in popular culture. Of course, these stories are not literally true, but they reveal a deeper truth about the anxieties of the times. Mitsuji's curse became a way for people to explain a shocking event without having to face the uncomfortable truth that the system they lived in was so corrupt that it could drive a good person to rebellion. Her ghost became a convenient scapegoat and a thrilling plot device. From a whispered phrase in Newfoundland, to a bloody dinner in a Scottish castle, to a mysterious illness in London, and finally the curse of a ghost in Osaka, we have traveled down the strange alleys of history. Each story is a fragment, a puzzle with many missing pieces. Basque fisherman, a scheming Earl of Scotland, the anonymous searcher in London, and the vengeful ghost of Japan. They are all part of a vast tapestry of human mystery. They remind us that history is not simply a linear record of events, but a chaotic collection of secrets, beliefs, and stories that echo through the ages, often leaving more questions than answers. The stories we have explored are just a few fragments in the endless kaleidoscope of the past. They are reminders that history is not always a straight path illuminated by indisputable truths. Often, it is more like a forest path, where light filters through the leaves, creating strange shapes and deceptive shadows. Sometimes the truth is buried at the bottom of the ocean with secretive sailors. Sometimes it is hidden in the machinations of power in the halls of royalty. And sometimes it is twisted into a ghost story to explain the inexplicable. From Basque seafarers who chased riches in silence, to Fat James who seized power through treachery. From Londoners dying of an unnamed disease, to believers in Osaka dying for a false faith, they all show that the past is more complicated than we think. Their stories challenge us to look beyond what is written in books. They invite us to question, to doubt, to listen to the whispers in the wind. Because learning history is more than just memorizing dates and events. It is a journey into human nature, with all its grandeur, brutality, faith, and madness. And perhaps the appeal of these mysteries lies not in finding the final answer, but in the search itself, in piecing together the clues, in feeling the thrill of a new truth revealed, and in accepting that some secrets may forever remain beyond our reach, twinkling like distant stars.